My returning guest today is Jonathan Anomaly. He is an academic, he is a writer, the author of Creating Future People, The Ethics of Genetic Enhancement. He is also someone who is a partner in a new venture, quite interesting, that you will probably hear quite a lot about in the press because it's a very controversial thing. Let's say it's in the field of genetics and leave it at that. More to be shown in the future. And today we talk about one of his most recent papers on Enlightened Tribalism, which is a new, interesting way to look at something that is a human instinct. Tribalism is something that liberal cosmopolitanism tried to knock out of people unsuccessfully, as we can see with the new political reshuffle. And this is his 2 cents on what a potential structure that includes tribalism might look like politically. So, this is what we discussed today. And if you do enjoy this conversation, please subscribe at alexisuta.com. That is my Substack. You can be part of the community. You can get access to everything I've written and everything I've recorded in the past. You could also go to Patreon if you just like the audio of the podcast. It's patreon.com/aksubversive. Every contribution is appreciated. And this is how the lights are being kept on. Thank you so much. Enjoy the conversation with Jonathan Anomaly. So, enlightened tribalism. This is a new spin on the old-timey tribalism. It is different from liberal cosmopolitanism, but in what way? What does it bring to the table? Yeah, what is the outline of this concept?
Yeah, sure. Let me give you a little background here. In 2024, my co-author and I, Felipe Faria, he's a Portuguese philosopher, we wrote a couple of papers, and the truth is academic timelines are very long. So we wrote these in 2020, which in some ways were like the height of the worst parts of liberalism manifesting themselves in the US and the UK and so on. So we were especially pessimistic in 2020. But we wanted to give a kind of evolutionary analysis to liberalism and say, look, it's got a lot of great features, actually. It produces a lot of wealth. How does it do that? Through private property rights, free exchange, the kinds of signals that a free price system gives to products and so on. So we know that liberalism tends to produce wealth and that it also extends sort of equal rights to all, which we support, especially within a particular society. But we thought, what the hell is happening, especially with a kind of progressive cosmopolitan version of liberalism? And what's going to replace it? So we published these two papers. The first is called Can Liberalism Last? Demographic Demise and the Future of Liberalism. And the second is called Enlightened Tribalism. So just the first one, 2 minutes on that. Basically, what we wanted to argue is, when you think big picture, evolutionary terms, how does evolution work? Well, there's the fundamental unit of selection, which is the gene, right? So genes are the things, as Richard Dawkins says in The Selfish Gene, that last through time, right? We're a vehicle for genes transmitting themselves, we, the organisms. So natural selection acts on genes, but then it also acts on organisms, right? Genes sort of assemble themselves into organisms and they behave in different ways, and they're healthier or unhealthier or smarter or dimmer or whatever. And so obviously the individual is a unit of selection too, right? It's a thing that survives or doesn't survive, ultimately the genes that create the individual. But then, and this is the important thing for liberalism and tribalism, evolution also acts on groups, right? So organisms behave in different ways, but then groups of organisms, especially for humans, really behave in different ways. It's true for bacteria and viruses as well. They have kind of group evolutionary strategies, but people definitely do. And maybe most famously, one way of encapsulating this from E.O. Wilson, the famous biologist, he said more or less, when you think about group competition or strategies that groups employ evolutionarily, says often, selfish behavior beats altruistic behavior within groups, but groups of altruistic individuals beat groups of selfish individuals. And you see that in war, especially. A group that prizes loyalty, fidelity, a group that's got a sense of nationalism, a sense of why we're the best, a sense of, you might call it parochial altruism, right? You're acting for the good of the group, not the whole human race or all species, but your group. that tends to be evolutionarily adaptive. And so when you're thinking about, so big picture evolutionary biology, we've got units of selection, the gene, the individual, and the group. And, sometimes evolution acts on these different units separately, and there's some tension between them. But ultimately, for humans especially, because we're groupish, right? Aristotle defined us as a political animal, a social animal. What really matters is the kind of political ideology that unites us, that kind of brings us together or separates us. Those are the things that survive or don't survive, and then produce, through the incentives they create, behaviors that individual organisms engage in. And those behaviors can be adaptive or non-adaptive. So when you think about liberalism, going back to the beginning, it's like, because of this idea that it prizes freedom and equality above all else, that it prizes private property, exchange, all these things that are mostly good, they produce so much wealth that they actually suppress fertility. They suppress birth rates. They also, because liberalism tends to, it's supposed to be politically neutral on the good life, right? It's supposed to say, look, there are many ways of living, and many of us enjoy this actually, right? In liberal societies, freedom to experiment in different ways and so on. It also tends to lose religion. It tends to lead to a decline in religion. Why? Because it can't prioritize one way of life over another. Christian, Muslim, atheist, gay, straight, whatever. And again, I'm not criticizing it, at least not yet, but I am arguing that a political ideology like that makes people both wealthy and individualistic and prize toleration above group identity is going to suppress fertility. And we see that statistically. I don't need to review the statistics, I take it. More right-wing or conservative societies have higher fertility. And within liberal societies, those more traditional ways of life, as you well know, tend to have higher fertility and so on. And so our evolutionary analysis then, this is the first paper, is that in a sense, whether we like it or not, liberalism can't last, not over long, long periods of time. It's going to be overtaken by some form of tribalism. Then we go into the second paper, what form of tribalism is the best? Does that make sense?
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, um, how does enlightened tribalism differ from like multipolarity? You hear this a lot of times, discussed kind of in the idea that, okay, nationalism, but, kind of a friendly form of nationalism where we accept that, I guess, American hegemony slowly fades. And then, is there a place for America as a hegemon in an enlightened tribalist universe in the future? Or will the whole chessboard have to shift around?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll define tribalism and then get to that. Our preferred view, this is Felipe and I, is, we don't support empires, like whether it's the US empire or necessarily the Roman Empire. It may be a necessary consequence of some states just having more power than others. I mean, there's always going to be a sense in which you want to exert your power over others to control what they do and gather more resources. We see this right now with Trump. Like, he's such an instinctive guy, like him or not. He's not always well read, but he has these kinds of instincts, right? And his instinct is, I like America, so I want it to expand. Let's buy Greenland. Let's take back the Panama Canal. I don't know how much, I guess he's given some thought to this. I don't want to say he hasn't thought about it, but it's almost just this instinct that people have, that's how you consolidate your power. And I guess that's true. We don't think that's the best way to live. We like instead the more multipolar view that you mentioned, where it's like, look, there are just different centers of power. We think that's better for each group and for all groups, because it's obvious that when one group controls most of the others, whether it's monetarily or through threats of war, although it can have a stabilizing influence, as it probably did after World War II, it can also lead to a kind of universal, well, I guess it was called, 10 years ago, global homogenization, this actual lack of diversity, because one power exerts itself on everyone else. So yeah, we don't tend to support that, but maybe I can define tribalism. So, I
Hmm.
get this is a simple definition, but a friend of mine, really good friend who was a colleague at Duke University many years ago, he's retired now, named Alan Buchanan. In a sense, we're writing this paper against him, even though he's a really good friend and a great guy. He's a defender of cosmopolitan liberalism. He thinks this is the peak of, morally speaking, what we can do, just expand those moral circles until they encompass everyone, every group, every nation. And what we try to do is push back on that and say, look, but we accept his definition. He says, in terms of tribalism, it's just a way of dividing the world into us and them. He sees that as bad. We see it as neutral, right? But it's necessarily exclusivist and parochialist, right? So as soon as you say, I endorse tribalism, what you're saying is, I endorse a view whereby some tribes are considered, at least within the tribe, better than others. It's exclusivist. And what we want to say is that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be in the form of, when we see the kind of bellicose tribalism of World War II, where we say there's us and there's them, and we're so superior to them that we actually want to exterminate them. Yeah, we agree that's bad. But we don't think that's necessarily part of tribalism. We think, basically you can have special obligations toward your tribe in the same way that you do toward friends and family. So I'll give you an example, and then ask you a question maybe. But think of what your husband would do. It's your birthday, your anniversary, and you come home after a long day, you're taking care of the kids, maybe you're doing some work, and then nothing, no dinner, no flowers, and you're like, damn, I'm pretty disappointed. He forgot my birthday. And why are you disappointed? He has special obligations to you, right? He should remember your birthday, not the neighbor's birthday, not, his ex-girlfriend's birthday. And then he says to you, actually, Alex, I remembered your birthday, but I took that money and I bought 10 bouquets of flowers for random African tribes because the utility analysis was that's clearly going to generate more happiness. That makes you even angrier, not less angry. And that's because tribalism is completely natural. Parochialism is not only inevitable, but it's actually considered a good thing among friends, among family. And then we're going to argue it can be really good among nations. It gives you a special sense of meaning. It gives you a reason to get up in the morning. And we argue, relative to cosmopolitan liberalism, that kind of meaning, which can take the form of nationalism, religiosity, that ultimately can probably also increase birth rates relative to liberalism. And so in that sense, it's both intrinsically good, at least in some forms, and is going to be an evolutionarily stable strategy. If you think of political ideologies as kind of, indirect strategies for organisms to survive.
Mm-hmm. So you're essentially kind of arguing for concentric circles of special relationships
Exactly.
with family, friends, coworkers, I guess, local, national level, but the maintenance of those special relationships. I think probably freedom of association would be one major step in that direction, maybe step back, depending on who you ask,
Yeah.
because that's kind of been a bit of a hobby horse on the right, because that is essentially what does not allow the formation of those concentric circles, because it essentially decides that at your door is where your special relationships stop, and then from then on it's pretty much everyone for themselves. And obviously citizens, non-citizens, there's still a little bit of a difference, but that difference has eroded extremely hard, especially in Western Europe and in the US as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's what if you could maybe go back into the definition. What are the layers of enlightenment here? Because it's not quite ethno-nationalism. What is the enlightened part here?
Yeah, I think the enlightened part is, so first of all, tribalism can take many different forms. I'm not particularly religious, but I recognize religion is clearly, more than anything else, gives people a sense of meaning. It evolved to do that, gives people a sense of identity, a set of rules to follow, always moral rules. It tends to be pronatal, not by accident, I think. So one kind of tribalism, and it can be enlightened, is your religion. Another, of course, ethnicity can be one. Nationalism, or your nation, can be one where it's multiple ethnicities within a nation, but there's a vision of the good, and it's a shared vision of the good. So what would make one of those enlightened versus not enlightened? And I think the enlightened part really is at least among the leaders, it's not going to be all ordinary people, right? Because ordinary people, in a way, by definition, a tribe of people needs almost irrational affiliations. You need, this is why we have, jerseys and sports and songs and colors and music and flags and rituals. And actually, if you try to deconstruct all those and rationalize them all to everyone, right, they kind of actually lose their meaning almost by definition. So in a way, the enlightened part is for the leaders and the thinkers. So it's elitist in its conception, but that's good, not bad, right? I mean, in a political ideology probably should be elitist in the sense that some people are more capable than others of understanding why we have rules, why we should form our society the way we do. And the enlightened kind would be, leaders would have some self-consciousness about why they have the rules they do, the traditions they do, and why it's good to uphold them, while also realizing, like, look, it can be reckless to make the move from my tribe is better than other tribes, which we think is actually a good thought to have. You should transmit that view to your own people. But it can be reckless to go from that view to the view that others are worthy of contempt or even extermination or, aggressive wars. And so there's this huge difference between pride in your own civilization, your own people, however you define that, and the thought that other people are worthy of utter contempt. And the only reason we confuse these, or the primary reason we do now for the last 80 years, is World War II. It really is that simple. The norms that follow World War II, we just have the most extreme negative sum tribalism, where it's like, Hitler not only kills, Jews and Poles and Slavs, I mean, he kills the best Germans, right? Millions of Germans march to their death in total humiliation and then have to accept for the next century utter subjugation, right? And this sense of we're unworthy of being a group and we're terrible. And it's like, who was that good for? It was terrible for everyone. And so our view is, the enlightened version of tribalism is, let's try to figure out a system of thought that avoids that, where, again, you should have a special attachment to your people, your group, but you should also, the leader should be consciously aware that there are positive sum games. There are reasons to cooperate with other groups, rather than to subjugate them, enslave them, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think by giving this explanation that this is an elitist train of thought, this is an elitist concept,
Yeah.
you've essentially taken democracy off the table. So, could you envision an enlightened tribal democracy? Because the thing is, like you mentioned, people, the masses tend towards all or nothing thinking. It's very black or white. We're either support the outgroup with maximalist, or we're tribalist in the old way. So do you think that this would be
Yeah.
possible under democracy, or do we need to reshuffle the deck?
Yeah, good question. So I do think it's possible under democracy, but somewhat unlikely maybe. So first of all, it's worth saying there are degrees of democracy. So like obviously the American founders, arch liberals, clearly, if there ever were liberals, they would be Jefferson and Franklin and Madison. And their version of, I mean, they didn't talk much about democracy. They talked pretty badly about it, but they did talk about republicanism, which is a limited form of democracy, where there is a kind of elite status among the leaders, and they are considered intellectuals. And yeah, most people have the right to vote, but maybe it's people with a certain level of education or property or something like this. I'm not going to advocate for one view or another here. All I would say is that even those who support the fullest form of democracy typically put a lot of faith that the elites really should be leading the people. So let's move from the American founders to the most extreme left-wing American progressives in 2020, right? Like, what is their view? They're constantly talking about saving our democracy by getting Trump off the ballot, by, rooting out so-called domestic extremists, which were usually, everyone from like moms who are concerned about, trans education in the schools to whatever, any ideas that didn't go along with the kind of elite progressive worldview were considered, quote, misinformation. I mean, that word developed very recently to sort of designate people who were against this worldview that the elites had basically consolidated around. And so my view is, look, all societies, and Plato agreed with this, democracy, dictatorship, anything in between is a form of oligarchy. There are always oligarchs. It's just a question of who the oligarchs are, how we determine that, and how transparent the process is. So in that sense, I do think any of these views are compatible with democracy, although probably enlightened tribalism would be more compatible with the kind of republicanism where you don't have this view that, 14-year-olds should vote. They're just as wise as, 35-year-olds with education. I mean, that's just silly, obviously. And so, extending the franchise to like everyone at all ages, maybe that's too much democracy, right? But in a way, everyone agrees with that. I think these are degrees. And yeah, maybe I can quote Aristotle. I have this quote in the paper I really like from Aristotle because it reminded me of Joe Biden at the time in 2020 and Keir Starmer now. He says a tyrant is someone who treats foreigners better than their own citizens, which is like weirdly what late stage kind of cosmopolitan liberalism did. There's like this special status granted to outsiders. It's almost the inverse of enlightened tribalism, where you've got this sense that like everyone matters equally, but some matter more than others. And those some are the outsiders, not the insiders. This is so perverse, so at odds with human nature, and so at odds with, again, group level selection. If you want a group to survive, and presumably it's your group, I mean, you can't have leaders that think like this. And if this is what democracy produces, then that's bad. If this is what dictatorship produces, then that's bad. So I think, yeah, this view is compatible with a lot of specific political ideologies because it's a really general view. But yeah, it probably tends to steer clear of the most extreme forms of democracy where just everyone has equal rights to everything and voting all the time, elections every 6 months or something. I mean, that's one form of democracy. Does anyone support that? I mean, why not vote every month instead of every 4 years? Nobody really supports that. So
Yeah, I think the Aristotle quote, I see that as more of a kind of a description of exerting power. Even if you think about it at like the nuclear level in a relationship with, like an abusive parent or an abusive spouse or something, they will treat outsiders better than they treat you because that's an exertion of power. That's how they exercise their power on you. And I think that's, something that is happening in the West. It's kind of, power flexing its muscles and showing you that actually, no, we're in charge and we will
that's
treat you.
interesting. So it's a signaling game in your view. Yeah, that makes sense actually.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that, it's is part of it. Also, I think, people are at the top definitely, and people of, Keir Starmer's generation especially, are true believers in the cosmopolitan dream, and they see people within their own countries who oppose it, which is the right wing, lower class, and a gaggle of elites as
Hmm.
enemies of an ideology that they believe in probably more than they believe in whatever religion they're maybe nominally affiliated with. So
Yeah, I tend to agree that they're true believers. There's not some conspiracy. They're not acting on behalf of, the World Economic Forum or George Soros. I mean, yeah, Soros can influence local elections with money, but there's no secret bidding they're doing. They're true believers. And in a way that goes back to, you're going to have a tribe, you're going to have a religion of some kind. And, Keir Starmer is a secular believer in cosmopolitan liberalism. And actually, I probably was too as a teenager. You imbibe this ideology in school and through the media, and it's kind of natural. And it does make you feel good about yourself. Like,
yeah.
imagine the signal you send to yourself when you're like, yeah, I know I feel like I should do something special for my wife and my family, but look how superior I am. I can actually afford to ignore their needs and meet the needs of these others. Wow, like they're not as enlightened as I am.
Yeah,
So
there's something edgelordy about this whole
yeah,
kind of utilitarian mindset where it's like,
yeah,
screw you, dad. I'm leaving and I'm going to save the world through my rationally invested donations. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
what do you make of kind of other axes that we see? Because what's interesting and what's new in the field of tribalism nowadays is that the national level of aggregation is not the only one that people split among tribal lines. Like the internet has made it so that within your own house, you might have people who are like extremely tribally polarized, especially between generations, like children and parents
Hmm.
politically. Um, Gender polarization is huge. I mean, if you look at North Korea, it's a huge political battle. You know, can you be enlightened about tribalization on other axes, or should we be focused about this? Would this work in a world that there the kind of the fragmentation is increasing, and there's just so many ways in which you can be pissed off about your neighbor.
Yeah, or love your in-group who you've never met.
Exactly.
Yeah, the sort of biology network state kind of thing. Um, yeah, it's an interesting view. And actually, one argument against us, is, I mean, we're kind of almost extrapolating from history and evolutionary patterns, thinking in terms of, game theory in the broad sense of evolutionarily stable strategies, and sort of saying, well, look, this is it in the past, this is what's worked, and in the future it will too. Maybe it won't, although maybe it just changes, like you said. So instead of ethnic group, for example, which clearly would have been like the main thing around which you identify, and religion would have been tied with your ethnic group, like Islam and Arabs were in a way tied together for obvious reasons. They co-evolved, and Christianity and Europeans and so on, Mormonism and the Dutch, Dutch Americans. And now it's kind of funny that like you see these like Hawaiian Mormons and Australian Aborigine Mormons. It's almost disconcerting because in a weird way, this was kind of the Dutch way of expressing, their way of life at the time. But yeah, I mean, maybe what'll happen is, we will have some of these weird new tribes. And these are, by weird, I mean, actually some of my friends and some people you've interviewed and stuff. You take like the Collinses, or take like even Elon Musk, maybe not be the greatest example, but people who are both pronatal and who value certain things. They value a certain kind of civilization or way of being. Maybe they come from different countries and they have like super or sub-national groups that unite them. And I suppose you can do an evolutionary analysis of them too, right? In the same way you can talk about the Amish within America. Here we're not talking about Amish Americans per se, because they're not concerned with America, they're concerned with their group. And so you might have sub and supranational groups that you divide the world into, and the ones that are both pronatal and that have a strong sense of identity, and a strong sense that, in a sense, we're just better than them. Like maybe we don't want to kill them or whatever, but like we're better than them, and we are willing to defend ourselves and our way of life, maybe with arms if necessary, right? Those are the groups that are going to succeed. Now, the internet autists, who are just like, I don't know, Koreans and let's say French kids who are just like playing games together, they're like a group or whatever, or network states where it's like, I live in India, you live in whatever, let's say Romania, and like you contract with me for cheap labor, and we develop a friendship. Like that's not really a group in my sense of the word. It's not a tribe. It's not strong enough. It doesn't give us meaning. We don't have differential birth rates, because obviously we're living in different places. We're not like mating together and so on. So in a way, you have to have some common geography. You have to be actually, meeting and mating, or else you're not going to have differential birth rates.
Yeah, is there a possibility that liberalism will be saved by reproductive technology? Because it's kind of the big downside here is that people are not having children. Is there a way?
Mm-hmm.
Because I could imagine liberals tend to be more into reprotech, um, high openness,
That's right.
openness to technology, things like that. Obviously, conservatives tend to have more children, but culturally, it's things have tended towards the left. So is there a way, maybe, that there will still be a liberal future if reprotech really takes off? Obviously, the problem with
Yeah.
reproduction is not just that people aren't having babies or have problems having babies. It's number one, do you want them? And number two, who's going to raise them? That's, I think, the big bottleneck.
Yep.
So, but yeah, I think new technology might step in to help with maybe some of this, most of this, who knows? Do you think that that's a possibility, and then we could save save liberal civilization through the bottleneck?
I think, first of all, some liberal societies probably will survive a long time. The U.S. is undergoing some pretty interesting things right now, actually, right? And it's gonna, as always happens, we export our best and our worst ideas. And right now, there's some interesting things happening. So we'll see. Over 1,000-year period, well, most societies don't survive, but these general ideas, which seem to suppress fertility quite drastically, can they survive? I don't know. Maybe they can in smaller forms, right? But we will see. The idea of reprotech interacting with this, though, is really interesting. Of course, it goes back to our last conversation a couple of years ago. Let's see. I mean, let's just play out the thought experiment. Like, what is reprotech going to do? And of course, as you know, I have a company that's going to launch publicly soon, and there are others that are doing this on a smaller scale. Like, what can you do? Well, through embryo selection, you're going to be able to calculate polygenic scores that reduce disease, boost IQ at least a bit, maybe more in the future. And so, what are you going to be able to do? Well, like, increase the odds at better outcomes, right? Which we've already been doing for the last 200 years with antibiotics and other health interventions, like just basically making sure kids are healthier, don't have neurodevelopmental risks. We actually have a new predictor for that in our company. We have all kinds of interesting things going on. And yeah, there are like tech friendly kind of, you might call them liberals in the classical sense, who are especially interested in this, pro freedom, kind of pro tech people. Now, I think for them to, in a sense, in evolutionary terms, like outcompete, religious groups and tribalists at a national level, right? Some of which, by the way, are bad, right? Like the Taliban or something like this. Like, you and I don't think like this is a model for how we should live. Like, I would never want to live under that. But does it have high birth rates? Like, yeah, it does actually. And so in that sense, it's beating us. It is winning. Could reprotech enable this? I don't think it can without a kind of ideology, without a set of beliefs that unite the people who are doing it. Now, it is, here's one way though that it could. I mean, we could, not through a top-down method, but through a bottom-up set of norms, we could end up in a society where we go through this, like, this bottleneck, this reproductive bottleneck, which we're going through right now, right? There's almost no way to avoid it. And on the other end, emerge a set of norms whereby it's higher status to be a parent than not to be a parent. And in a way, that kind of has to happen. Like, either that's going to happen or we do go extinct or close to extinct. And so I can imagine societies that just prize parenthood above all else. And yeah, they use some reprotech. Eventually, embryo selection becomes, gene editing, and probably that's not too far off. And yeah, we can reduce disease, increase or decrease mortality, increase IQ, all these kinds of things, select for personality traits. But I do think actually that is secondary to the norms that will, in a way, consciously emerge from this bottleneck. So for most people, it'll be unconscious, but for the elites that see the problem, and again, you could think of Elon Musk and others who are writing about this, they're very aware of this. And they're trying to seed ideas that basically make it high status to be a parent. And I think that's both good morally. I'm a pro-natalist. I think you are too. It's good morally. And from an evolutionary standpoint, it's the only way we're going to survive. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's already happening in some ways. I mean, you mentioned Elon Musk.
Yeah.
He's, pretty much one of the most influential people in the world, richest, most connected, especially nowadays. He's, a serial breeder, and he's
Yeah.
very open about it as well. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think a norm change is essentially what's needed, because
exactly.
liberalism, essentially the neutering aspect of it, is the norms that evolve out of individualism, and
That's right.
what is high status, and what people are set to seek. And obviously this is tied into wealth, and people tend to want to do conspicuous consumption, to have status battles in that domain. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way because the resources are here. There's not really a cap on resources. There is a cap in the way we've structured our lives, in the sense that, a lot of people, because of like, you want to move away to get a better job, all this kind of libertarian impulse that everyone has, and it's normal. People don't want to live with their parents if they can help it. But it really has kind of put a cap on childcare. And childcare also,
Mm.
it's quite expensive. Good school, you need a good house in a good area. So, you know, raising your kids right, especially if you're middle class or upper class, is quite an expensive endeavor. And, that kind of caps how many children you want to have. Do you want to live like medieval peasant? You don't. You want to have, everyone wants to have a good life for themselves and their children, keep up with the Joneses, all that type of stuff. So it kind of
Yep.
escalates how much it costs. If there were interventions, if the new society that's going to emerge, whatever, in 100 years, does prize parenthood, a kind of a reshuffling of what that would entail. And I think Reproductive can help here because it does push out the window of fertility for a lot of women, because a lot of the loss in actual additional fertility is for women who start later. So families are formed
Yep.
later, women start having children later because they want to have their individualist phase, and Reproductive can help them kind of prolong that, and maybe even prolong the whole span of their life. Not necessarily Reproductive, but tech in general, and then kind
Yeah.
of ensure that you actually get to live your life with your children, especially if you have small children, maybe in your 40s or something like that. So
Yep.
yeah, it's I think there is potential on the horizon, but yeah, like you said, the kind of the main tipping point has to be normative. It has to be tied to status. And yeah,
And what you said, I think, is so conspicuous consumption, status games, whatever. Um, this could become a status battle, like you said. I mean, so having children and even having them young in a world of plenty, right? Where we actually have, let's say, AI and biotech keep evolving, so we live longer, richer lives with more money to spend on different things. At some point, I mean, I think we've already hit the point. It's kind of boring to be like, oh yeah, I've been everywhere in the world and done every kind of drug, and it's like, so now what? Your life's kind of hollow. Do
yeah,
you have any
and
kids? Do you have a
that's
family? Like,
exactly what happened. Why Jordan Peterson was, he really kind of hit a nerve when he was essentially speaking to this. People are already at that point, especially kind of middle class, upper class people who have had fun. You kind of tap out on the materialism of life.
mm-hmm.
Obviously, children are complicated and hard in
Yeah,
other ways, but it's just a completely different dimension. You're almost kind of leveling up in some way, if you want to use, internet lingo. It's just a
yeah,
different thing that people, even as an experience, because, millennials are obsessed with experiences.
yeah.
It's a different experience, and
So we
it's
could sell
one.
this. This is the ultimate experience. Yeah,
Exactly,
being a
package
mother.
it as,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think in terms of just my set of questions here, yeah, exactly. There is a question about this related to who can participate. Is this oriented towards Western style democracies currently, or is this a system that you see? For example, can Cameroon be a country that you could envision could have an enlightened tribalist
Yeah, why not?
system?
Sure. Yeah, exactly. I think one of the benefits too of tribalism, and especially this kind of positive, I think of this as positive sum tribalism, is yeah, Cameroonians probably do certain things really well. I don't know anything about them. I've been to a few countries in Africa, but different groups have different average propensities, abilities, and every group is good at certain things, and like maybe they want to accentuate those things. It's like think of Kenyans and races and things and certain kinds of cultural achievements and so on. And it's almost kind of weird that there's this liberal impulse to level every valley, as Nietzsche said about liberalism, right? Level every mountain and valley. It's actually a boring world. A much more interesting world and one with more meaning is where, yeah, Cameroonians develop themselves in ways that they consider uniquely interesting and their own culture. And the same thing goes for all groups. And when you think about, there's a kind of Hayekian argument anyway that liberals can't really know how to develop Cameroon. Like we can see if they're starving and dump a bunch of food on them, but even that doesn't usually work. We think of the 1980s in Ethiopia. famously, they went through a famine, and there was this whole international effort to alleviate it. What did we do? We dumped a bunch of food on them, which was good in the short run. Starving people had food, and then their population tripled, and their farmers went broke because you can't compete with free food, right? If you're trying to produce food at a price. And then we had 3 times the amount of people to feed, and they had little incentive to figure out like what caused the famine and how do we like rearrange our political system so that we can solve this problem in ways that are unique to us. So I mean, there is a kind of Hayekian argument that foreign leaders don't have, in general, except for really rare occasions, the ability or the information to figure out how to develop other societies or to develop them in ways that those societies value. We constantly impose our own liberal values on those others. And I would say the one value in that, the one benefit is like, look, it's really the British and British liberalism, like this idea that everyone should be accorded some basic equal rights or equal rights under the law, an equal hearing in court. I actually do think that is a wonderful thing. And I don't really know how a society could be worse off with that, right? Like being guaranteed an equal and fair trial, among your peers, like that does seem to be, to me, better for everyone to have that system. Nevertheless, I wouldn't be willing to go to war with Cameroon to impose it on them. I think if those insights from liberalism that truly are great, including, again, free markets and this sort of thing, at least within limits, we're going to succeed and other countries are going to copy it. And good. That's better for Cameroon than us saying, oh, by the way, we also know what your ultimate goals should be. Here's what you should be teaching in schools and so on. I think that's just disastrous for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, liberal imperialism has been, it's kind of been
Yeah.
sold very, as it usually comes packaged as, NGOs, as aid. There's always some, the price to be paid is at least you have to mouth the platitudes that they're selling, go to the courses and things like that. But yeah, I mean, it is really interesting to me to see a lot of, from developing countries, because I'm coming from like kind of from a second world place, and the effects of Western wealth, it's kind of like a resource curse, dumped onto other countries, especially with immigration, because, here, obviously, the borders are quite porous, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, people go there all the time. But, there are large scale effects on the countries that are sending people who are receiving them back. And it's even more so in Africa, because the Western money that comes in, it's it doesn't go into development or anything. People aren't, they're not paying taxes here, not building businesses. Especially it's pretty much, essentially the argument for brain drain. But it
Mhm.
really is a worldwide effect, and it really stops, another Hayekian argument. It really stops the local economies from independently developing. There is information coming in, there is help, but it's essentially, what you'd get if you had an internet connection. It's not necessarily more information. So yeah, it really is in a way a tax, not only in kind of ideologically on the cultures that kind of border the Western Empire, which is essentially the whole world, but
Mhm.
also just financially as well. And you see this especially in Romania, because we've had a lot of development since since the European Union, joining the European Union. But at the same time, local economy is still flagging. The government's essentially just managing structural funds from the EU. There's not really been a lot of local development, in the sense that, say, there's not really much local industry. We've got, parks for, international companies to come to produce motors for Japan here. Obviously, they create some jobs, they create some wealth, but the taxes don't really go here, because just the positioning, the company knows how to manage its tax base. So yeah, it's just, I don't know, it's just all a little bit hollow. You can have development from it, but it's not the same type, same quality of development that you get from just, kind of being left to your own devices and having to figure it out.
Right. So would you
Yeah.
say would you say then, in a way, Romanian leaders, because obviously they can get revenue from trade agreements, from the EU, from obeying certain rules and so on, especially with migration with the EU, they're kind of jockeying for income and status or something from these like supranational groups like the EU, rather than thinking about, I don't know, developing their unique culture or history or something. Is that?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
people, especially like pretty much everywhere outside the West, has had levels of extreme poverty just very recently. And, people tend to glorify, how the deep cultures and the,
Yeah, fair
complexity
enough.
and religiosity of these peoples. But these were tools, these were social instruments that at the moment have lost their utility. Everyone wants
Mm,
Western money. Everyone would, sell their grandma for Western money. Everyone
mm,
wants Western status. That's the only status that exists.
yeah,
That's why you find people from outside of the West being more woke or more, like sycophantic to the whatever status hierarchy that they observe in the West than the Westerners themselves. So it's just, that's the thing that's out there. We want more of it. We want more wealth faster. Just give us that. I could imagine even if they close the borders now, pulled out the internet cable and people would still be running the same software because it's just
that's
so
interesting.
it really is hegemonic. So um in a way, yes, that was a political move, but people also wanted that. That's what I'm saying. It's
Yeah, and obviously income buys you things, including family. If you want to have a bunch of kids, it helps to have more money. It's especially if you don't have family like I know you do, partly to take care of your kids. Yeah, so I understand that. I mean that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and also
Sure.
buys you freedom from your family, which I think a lot of
Yeah.
people underestimate because these places are always sold as, oh, so communitarian, so close
Yeah.
knit. You'd be surprised, like the exodus from the villages to the city and from the city to the west
Mm,
is insane. It's like
totally.
people do call their parents and they come home for Christmas, but it's not the idea that, oh, the communities are so tight knit. It's like the second you drop
Yep.
the promise of money status into it, all the old-timey social technologies just go away. So I
Yep.
don't know if it could have developed any other way. I mean, the thing is, once the Berlin Wall fell, everyone wanted the same thing. It was to become like the West, to be more Western,
Mm,
to
yeah.
imitate whatever forms of culture, whatever everything that came from the West. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe, I mean, so you've talked about sort of post-liberalism, which is a vague term, but post kind of maybe progressive liberalism of the 20th century, you know, and we also, some people talk about post-scarcity. I don't think we'll ever be post-scarcity, of course. We have a scarcity of time and attention and life and that sort of thing and resources. But maybe, this time is different in the sense that, we can take advantage of all of the things liberalism has given us. I've outlined a lot of them. I like a lot of them, right? So do you, I think.
Hmm.
And you're saying a lot of Romanians want them, right? We all want more wealth and at least enough freedom. Custom can be
Stanley Cups, you know.
it's definitely cops. Yeah, exactly. However, maybe especially because of AI doing some of the boring work and, in the future, I mean, and biotech giving us sort of longer, richer lives, maybe we'll be able to afford to have some of the benefits of liberalism without having the full global homogenization. And obviously we can trade between countries with, trade goods and ideas and technology without having a completely free flow of people and culture. And maybe what will happen, and maybe a version of tribalism that can survive, does really self-consciously, among the leaders anyway, take advantage of the best parts of liberalism. But it kind of throws out this part which says, under no conditions can you prioritize one way of life over another, right? Like the kind of society that's going to be stable over long periods of time, give its citizens unique meaning, is the kind of society that will have at least some vague version of the good to fight for and have some controls on immigration. It's just having infinite in and out flows of different cultures and people and so on is a recipe for lower social trust, lower sense of meaning. I'm not even making a moral judgment here, although I would say that's actually kind of bad. I mean, to the extent that meaning is a good thing for people. Um, and so, yeah, I think there will be some versions of enlightened tribalism will look very liberal, but not fully liberal because they're going to have to take a stance at some point and either be, well, probably both pronatal and push a sense of a collective good on people. without being, as you put it, fully communitarian, right? Not like communist or, the government is sort of monitoring everything you're doing or something, but communitarian in maybe the light sense of saying, look, we are different. We do have a unique civilization or a unique set of values. And yeah, we'll take some immigrants who are going to share those values and promote them, but we're not just kind of an open borders, open business place where people just flow in and out. That's just not the kind of place that's going to survive.
Yeah, I mean, it just kind of remind me of the ideal of maybe like mid-century Britain, where you kind of still had um,
Mm.
it relatively or very overwhelmingly homogenous place, trading with the Commonwealth, immigration from the Commonwealth. And then, but this is another one of those arguments of the, take me back to 1955. And obviously it is not 1955. Whatever comes next is going
And
to be something a bit different. But
exactly, and the problem with that view, which I used to hold, and in a way I still hold dear. You look at the literature and the culture of that time. I mean, what's not to like about 19th century Britain? Well, I mean, whatever, the colonies, yeah, you could say you shouldn't colonize other countries, but in terms of the internal politics, like whatever. There's Britain is a very healthy, very productive in all realms, right? Technology and art and music. It's a great society. But then you think, were they a fully liberal society? Not really, right? They weren't even living up to their own ideals, just in terms of female access to education and the rights of all minorities and so on. I'm not saying liberalism necessarily leads to open borders, although some actually think it does. I don't think it necessarily has to, but it does tend to universalize rights. Again, not saying that's good or bad, but then ultimately lead to norms that I think lead to more or less the situation we're in right now. And so if that's true, then the question is, yeah, is that ultimately going to be a desirable political philosophy? If Locke, who would despise, what he saw, what he would have seen in 2020 with our cities burning down, and in the US anyway, statues being torn down, and Britain as well. Would Locke have agreed with that? No, but was that in some way an indirect consequence of Locke? Maybe. And if the answer is yes or maybe, well, maybe it's not as desirable as we think if we just take a snapshot of 18th or 19th century England.
yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's just a law of nature that what can't go on won't go on. And I think,
Yeah,
all the
very
political upheaval that's happened in the last 10 years, and especially now very recently, and the direction is pretty clear. I think
true.
more and more people, even in whatever failed democracy experiments that we have in the West and otherwise, um, you know people are tending towards um, just an appreciation of what they have in the West. Because really, if you have any sort of experience of what happens outside the West, even close to the West, it really can't compare. It is the jewel on which everything else feeds. And even
Mhm.
just protecting it is not only in the interest of Westerners. Pillaging the West, might give you a momentary satisfaction. But if you have an IQ above 85, it won't, and you realize, okay, this is the golden goose that everyone in the world is feeding off in terms of technology, in terms of even energy provision, everything, all the
Medicine,
infrastructure.
power, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The health of and survival of your children is dependent on the existence and thriving of the West. And that's just basically it. And you see this, even here in Romania, people are tending towards that, even if it has kind of a nationalistic flavor. But recently, I think it was just a few months ago, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago, we had this strange election here in Romania where the TikTok candidate, a guy relatively unknown, essentially promoting a bit of a dumbed down kind of RFK Jr. type platform. Very, I mean, moderately nationalistic, full of weird esoteric, a very internet based,
Yeah.
kind of orthodoxy in there as well. All sorts of, very Romanian version of it, a bit crazy, a bit, delete 10 IQ points off of RFK, and that's what you get. Yeah, and whatever you think about that candidate, it tells you about kind of a direction that people want to go in, and it mirrors what's happening in the U.S. as well. So this is
Yep.
essentially kind of a right wing meme candidate.
Yep.
Obviously the European Union did not like it, canceled elections. It's going to get repeated, um, but it's in the water. It's coming. It's obviously already here. It has not trickled through the democratic process. It has not been let to trickle through. It's quite a controversial move that they did, but still, you know, yeah,
And
things are rolling in that direction. And once norms change, once all these preference cascades start rolling, I don't think it's too late for enlightened tribalism in the West.
well, in a way, it's the only thing that's going to save the best versions of liberalism. I mean, the best principles or norms from liberalism. So yeah, I mean, if the West doesn't become more tribal, it will stop being, as you put it, the golden goose, or the goose that lays the golden eggs. And nobody finds that, at least no thoughtful person would think that's a good outcome. It's bad for the West and bad for the world. So maybe what we see is some more tribal impulses, or some on the margins, less liberal ways of organizing things. And ultimately that will lead to the survival and thriving of the West, and the saving of the best part of liberalism.
Yeah, yeah, and we don't have to really throw all of this precious golden goose baby out with the
No,
bathwater.
exactly. We don't have to go back to, a pre-antibiotic world, or a world where we're always fighting each other. You look at the Greeks, and yeah, they had some great achievements. It was, I mean, it's the height of the ancient world, but they also were in permanent warfare. I mean, permanent, right? It was like every couple of years. So we don't
Exactly.
necessarily want that either.
Yes. And on that cheery note, I want to ask you the last question of the show. Do you have a thinker, a recommended thinker, underrated, which you would propose to the audience?
Always, yeah. So I'm a fan of the show, as you know. So I came prepared, like I did last time. Last time I threw you off with George Bernard Shaw. We were
Hmm.
talking about genetic enhancement or eugenics, and so I mentioned Shaw and his play Man and Superman. This time, because I actually talked to Jonathan Keeperman at Passage Press about this a few weeks ago, I was saying, hey, man, you really should republish this classic debate between J.B.S. Haldane, one of the great biologists of the 20th century, and Bertrand Russell, who you probably know is one of the great philosophers of the early 20th century. They had this debate in 1823, and I think everyone should read it. It's about each essay is like 20 pages long, and it's on the future of science and kind of your question: is science going to save us? Is it going to kind of be the out? But along the way, they're between the two world wars. So they're talking about, are we going to need a global coalition of governments, maybe even a world government? What's going to be the role of the US and Britain in this? What about eugenics? Are we just going to all dramatically improve ourselves? So they're debating all these things. And what I love about this debate, it's 1923, so it is no holds barred. I mean, there is no political correctness. It's just them writing down exactly what they think. So Haldane's essay is called Daedalus, or Science in the Future, so after the Greek myth. And then Russell answers him with Icarus, or the future of science. And what Haldane is trying to do is take this really optimistic view of science, which probably Russell shares, but Russell just decides to go all out and say, no, science is going to destroy us, and here's why. So if you'll humor me, I picked a quote from each of them,
Sure.
because I think it's just kind of fun to illustrate, like, just complete freedom of thought. So Haldane says, this is toward the end of the essay, he says, we must regard science from 3 points of view. First, it's the free activity of man's divine faculties of reason and imagination. Secondly, it's the answer to the demands of many for wealth, comfort, and victory. As we talk, victory in this case, possibly of war, because it helps you develop weapons and so on. And then finally, it's man's gradual conquest, first of space and time, then of matter as such, then of his own body and those of other living beings, and finally, the subjugation of the dark and evil elements of his soul. So it's like science is helping us conquer the world, helping us develop medicine, and even helping us master ourselves. I don't know, through psychology or something. I don't know what he had in mind there. And then
Ozempic.
Russell says, what's that?
Ozempic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, medication and genetics, whatever. And then Russell says, and this is really funny because Russell is like a secular liberal atheist who loves science. Just I guess playing the devil's advocate, he says, science enables the holders of power to realize their purposes more fully than they could otherwise do. If their purposes are good, then it's a gain. If they're evil, then it's a loss. And he says, Science has not given men more self-control, more kindliness, or more power of discounting their passions or deciding on a course of action. It's just given communities more power to indulge their collective passions. Men's collective passions are mainly evil, for the strongest of them are hatred and rivalry directed toward other groups. Relevant to our conversation, he's thinking about the Germans and the English right now. Therefore, at present, all that gives men power to indulge their collective passions is bad. This is why science threatens to cause the destruction of the world and civilization. The only solid hope, this is hilarious, by the way, thinking of the US hegemony, the only solid hope seems to be in the possibility of worldwide domination by one group, say the United States, leading to the gradual formation of a global economic order. So this is 1923. But perhaps, and this is hilarious, a slap at the US, in view of the sterility of the Roman Empire, what had happened to the Roman Empire once it took power, perhaps the collapse of our civilization would in the end be preferable to this alternative, to the global hegemon of the United States. Anyway, these are just some random passages that I love from this essay because it's just no holds barred, and it's really prescient too.
Yeah. Oh, yes. This is,
Literally
yeah.
100 years before today, talking about exactly what's likely to happen. So,
Yeah, I mean, the whole history of the 21st century is encapsulated in the interwar period. All the tensions are there; they're still here. Yeah, maybe
yep.
we'll never resolve them.
The
No,
movement toward a global government and the UN, obviously, precedes by the League of Nations, all of this stuff. Exactly. So,
exactly. So, Johnny, thank you so much for coming back on. Is there any place you want to send people? Anything you want them to read? Anything they want them to check out or know about?
yeah, nothing special, especially to shill. But yeah, if you're interested in these ideas, I've moved on from academia to a startup, which is really exciting. You'll all know a lot more about that in the coming months or year. But if you're interested in these ideas on the evolutionary stability of liberalism and enlightened tribalism, you can check out those two papers. So I have a website, jonathananomaly.com. You could link to it. All of my papers are on there, and yeah, feel free to read them.
Excellent. I'll link both the papers in here and also the site so people can go ahead and check those out. And yeah, this was lovely. Thank you for coming on. I hope we can do this a third time, maybe post launch, where we can discuss
Exactly. Yeah,
the
it'll be really
incredible
fun.
controversies you'll be in. Um, but yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Always love being here. Bye, Alex.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do like, subscribe, comment something positive. Please do also go to alexkashuta.com, which is my Substack, where you can find every episode ever recorded. You can find my writing, and you can find the community features, the wonderful community features of Substack.com, including the notes features. I spend a lot of time on Substack notes, much more than I do on Twitter lately, because I just have to displace my addiction to Twitter into something else, a little bit more productive. I don't know. Or you could go to patreon.com/aksubversive for the audio of every episode ever recorded. Thank you so much for your contribution and have a lovely rest of your day.